Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I think the numbers of participants are stabilizing or still growing a little, but I think we can begin. So welcome today. We're really excited to have you here for the next in the QAAFI seminar series. Today we'll be having a presentation on zero net emissions from agriculture, and we'll be talking about the upcoming CRC bid that UQ is developing to share what it's all about. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so today I will be facilitating the seminar. My name is Oliver Frith. I recently joined QAAFI as a business development manager. I have been working in the agriculture and natural resource management sector for the last 15 years in various roles across Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. Before joining QAAFI, I was the head of business development at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. So could I have the next slide, please? So before we start, I will do the acknowledgement of country. So the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Thank you. Okay, so before we begin the talk today, just some housekeeping rules. So we will have the meeting scheduled from 12 to 1, and so we will try to keep within that time frame. Secondly, we will have a Q&A section at the end of the seminar. We would like to kindly request that any questions you have, can you please use the Q&A function in Zoom rather than the chat. So please use Q&A for the questions at the end. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's my great honor today to introduce our presenter. So we have a presentation today from Professor Damien Hein. Damien has roles across both QAAFI and the Global Change Institute. He is an evolutionary economist, which means he focuses on innovation at the business and firm level, including looking at technological change and business model innovation. He's worked in a wide range of agricultural areas, including as an agricultural economist, where he's undertaken productivity studies in horticulture, written industry investment plans, and also worked for a number of international organizations such as the World Bank, the Global Environment Facility, ASEA, and international governments. He also, before coming back to QAAFI, ran the Chemi Business School at the University of Limerick in Ireland. So we're really grateful for Damien today to give us the time to present on the CRC bid and what it's all about. So without further ado, I will pass over to Damien for the presentation.
Thanks, Ollie. Before I start, I'll just also would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we meet today, and particularly to their ancestors and their descendants. Okay, so thank you for having me in this session. We're presenting here just very early stage work that we're undertaking in looking at a CRC, a Cooperative Research Centre, with the title Net Zero Emissions from Agriculture. And I'm going to give a fairly broad background today, because there's much that's unknown still with where we're at. But it would be, we just thought it'd be quite useful for people to see what's happening here, and especially to encourage engagement and involvement as we progress this process, which is a fairly long, substantial process. Sorry, just getting to that next slide. There we go. Okay, so in terms of CRCs themselves, they generally tend to be fairly significantly funded So the federal government funds a CRC in a critical area, which is a challenging area often. And the funding is often, between say $30 and $50 million over a 10-year program of work by the federal government. And then that is matched funding with industry funding and with university funding. So the programs, would range from say, 70 million over a 10-year program to upwards of 200 million over a 10-year program. And they're very much around, solving very difficult and complex problems. So one of the reasons, why they are kind of are what they are, they've been in place a long time now. I mean, quite a few people who are online would have been involved in CRCs at some stage, and they've been in place since around, I think, 1990 and 1991. Early on, the CRCs were able to go through multiple iterations and rounds and lasted, upwards of 15 years. These days, they're 10-year programs and one-time programs. So the idea of the CRCs is to co-develop and integrate innovative solutions to solve complex, in this case, emissions problems facing industry. They're meant to be industry-led, so there's close collaboration between industry, universities, government and community. And in this case, also driving the rapid industry adoption required to have an impact at scale and in time. A part of the kind of the requirements and the guidelines of the CRC program, which is also administered by the Cooperative Research Cooperative Research Association. So it does sit separately from the ARC and the NHMRC. So it's a very dedicated program there. But one of the guidelines is also having a commercial vehicle and trying to be quite innovative in the design of the CRC, the structure of the CRC, and the commercialisation, which I'll come to a little bit later in terms of intellectual property and commercialisation. So, why really a CRC in this area? Lots of reasons, but one of the key reasons, or a number of reasons there, are on the right-hand side. So agricultural emissions account for approximately 14% of total emissions nationally. And internationally, the figures are fairly similar as well. And then when we look at agriculture, across the different sectors within agriculture, 77% of those emissions are accounted for by methane emissions, particularly from livestock. 19% in terms of nitrous oxide, particularly around fertilizers, for example, and 4% in terms of carbon dioxide, and it can be from line production, but also some of the supply chain issues and things like that. So it is a really major issue. We've seen the IPCC reports. There's one which is about to come out. I just saw today that it was about to be released, but it's just been held back and delayed as governments, decide what they agree with and what they don't agree with. But in this case, the emissions are fairly clear, which is, going to impact, and is linked very obviously linked strongly to climate change and the ability to produce in the agricultural sector. It also, impacts long-term asset values and intergenerational assets as well. Now, we look at this happening at the moment, and we've been seeing it happening for a period of time, but it's also happening at a time where we're seeing growth nationally in agriculture. And the pursuit of $100 billion value by 2030. Now, even that figure of $73 billion for 2021, I think it's up to 80 already. So, the growth in the sector is really quite critically important. If you've got the sector growing, then there tends to be a little bit of a balance that needs to be found between that growth and the emissions there. And also there's a lot more investment in zero net emissions in terms of policy and investment aligning there as well. One of the things that we've seen when we've been developing this bid, and again, I do stress very early days on this process, is there is a lot of research and development activity underway. And we've seen, if you actually look at where a lot of that activity lies, we've seen industry move ahead quite well in the space and undertaking quite a bit of R&D, but it's quite defined R&D projects and processes that they're undertaking. We go back to policy, and given, in our case, national policy settings, we also then see research funding linked to the policy levers and the policy settings. So we haven't seen as much funding directed at zero net emissions in Australia. And if you actually compare that to overseas, you can see there's quite a bit of difference in terms of the degree of focus of funding as well as national policy in this space to date. So, you know, that again is an issue that is important to be tackled and to get alignment there as well. So the role potentially of a CRC then is to coordinate across industry, government, universities and community in as effective a way as possible, but also to be doing things at a sufficient scale that can have a meaningful impact on emissions at a national level. So I'll refer to this a little bit. There's a balancing act that really needs to be considered here and undertaken. So the way we're trying to frame the CRC and the bid is that we really want to ensure that we're supporting the growth of agriculture towards being a $100 billion industry by 2030. So we don't want to see anything which actually you know, negates or reduces that. We are clear that you know, the policies and the focus is shifting more and more towards zero net emissions. We would like to set a target of 2040 for those emissions, so that we're ensuring that we can get actually impact in time with the programs of work which are potentially being undertaken. And then the third aspect that's in this balancing act is really important, that if we really, from a national point of view in particular, but also an industry perspective, if we don't actually undertake action at a national level and a significant level as early and as substantially as we can, it will impact market access immediately and have an ongoing impact. So that could be at an international level, and we've seen EU in terms of their considerations of trade policy there and meeting emissions targets, but also in terms of access to, you know, niche markets and various forms of high value markets domestically as well. So this is kind of the balancing act that frames what we're putting forward here as the CRC bid as it progresses through its early stages. So with any CRC, there's a structure which is quite typical of a CRC. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to the most innovative structure and formulation for the CRCs in terms of their programs, but there's typically 3 to 4 programs which are undertaken in the CRC across its 10-year life. And given that our focus is on the emissions and the various, you know, the 3 areas defined there as well in terms of emissions, at this present time, we're framing the programs broadly around plant production systems. So and that includes farming systems, soil and fertilizer management, carbon capture and sequestration may well be a part of that. And again, these are under discussion with partners. So there's absolutely nothing set in stone here at this stage. The second program is the animal productions program. And you know, you could see there with the figures around emissions, methane is a very important part of that, and reduction strategies is quite critical. including things like feed supplements, pasture systems, animal and plant genetics, which are going to feed into that, and a whole of systems approach. So we don't see these, particularly if you look at those two programs, they don't operate in isolation. There's a lot of overlap in there and cross-pollination which occurs. The third program has, again, nothing set in stone, but to date, we've been defining that and changing actually that. We actually had that split into two different programs, but we have that currently as circular economy, supply chains and market access. So in terms of having an impact and actually coordinating efforts, circular economy is quite critical, not just in terms of the research and bringing the work in the other two programs together, but it's a really intractable issue for many in industry as well, because it's so complex, and it's an area that they kind of can tackle. Some are tackling to differing degrees, but because of its complexity, it sometimes lies outside of their remit. So it is quite challenging. In amongst that is also supply chains. So when you think circular as well, we're thinking of all the different scope emissions which can occur, and that process of getting to market is quite critical, and the supply chain emissions in there. So it kind of takes us into areas of carbon dioxide emission there as well. And that's then linked very strongly in with market access. So access to international markets, access to domestic markets as well. Every CRC has a very strong training component to it and capability development. So that's been designed as a fourth program into this to date, and it's an important requirement, again, in the CRC guidelines. The addition in there is no surprise, adoption is critically important. So any industry-led initiative here, what we're looking for is rapid uptake of the applied work which is undertaken across the CRC, and we really want to see the adoption happen as early as possible so that we can start to see an impact on emissions as early as we can see them. So there's no real rocket science to the design of this CRC to date. It follows a reasonably typical approach in terms of 3 to 4 different programs, which we try to interlink as much as possible. Again, for undertaking CRCs, there's a requirement for a clear governance model. And this is a fairly typical governance model which is undertaken. So I'll probably just go back a little step there, and I'll show you a slide later which goes into the bid process. So it's a 2-stage process. So stage 1 is just the initial bid. It's more kind of expression of interest. Stage 2 is much more complete bid. So it's quite a long process to actually go through a bid process, and then you have obviously the 10-year life of the CRC once it's established. So important though to outline and frame out the structure and the governance model for the CRC in the bid process as well. And that then has a board with an interim CEO and executive team, particularly the interim CEO nominated, and potentially an interim chair is nominated during the bid process. That, for many CRCs, that the interim CEO and the interim chair don't always transition into the bid, the CRC proper. So there are changes that happen there, but it's important to have that, try to get a CEO interim in place and a chair in place so that you're kind of guiding that governance model from early on. Obviously, this is about research, applied research and adoption of that research. So research and commercialisation advisory committees are a very strong and important part of a CRC structure. And then we have the industry and government reference groups in there. And that really, this CRC, as with any, should be a co-design, co-developed process. So you know, getting that involvement early is quite important in the bid process itself. And then underneath that, we have then the research programs, the translation and adoption, and the capability building. So the capability building fits with the training. We need to ensure that we have, you know, clarity around the translation and adoption of the research which is undertaken within and across the program. So when you look at the CRC, you know, and I've just given you that list of 4 programs, as a CRC commences, it goes through a process of, and they're done in quite different ways. You'll see quite a few different models for CRCs in terms of how they frame their programs and the relationship between the program and the projects which underpin the programs. But those projects can be kind of, you know, signalled, but they don't get formalised until the CRC proper. So it tends to be, you know, over the initial first year of the CRC that you get the proposal processes and the project initiation processes happening. And that tends to be a co-funding. So that's why it's quite important to have industry and government involved in their funding, which is matched by the federal government funding. When I say government, I mean in that case it would be, say, state governments, so you don't have federal government departments as partners in there, certainly not in terms of leverage funding. And then, you know, that co-funding is important in terms of the design, not just of the programs, but of the projects which are undertaken as well. So it has, you know, very substantial industry, community and government involvement from very early on at the program and then at the project level. And important in there is the capability building. So there are pretty substantial training programs which are normally undertaken within CRCs. And then, of course, the translation and adoption is a very important part of that process. So, again, you know, what we're doing in this early days of the CRC, following the guidelines and ensuring that we're meeting those requirements as we go through these early steps. This is an area in terms of the intellectual property and the commercialisation where there are plenty of things to consider, and there is some flexibility around the structure and the format of an entity. There's typically in the guidelines they want to see an independent commercialisation entity, and so that kind of takes it out of the universities, out of the industry partners. And so, you know, kind of has it sitting within or attached to the CRC itself. So that governance model includes a commercialisation entity in there typically. But, you know, beyond that, there are very different ways that CRCs are run, and they're varying. Even, you know, looking at current CRCs and current CRC bids, they differ quite markedly in terms of the openness of the intellectual property principles, in terms of, you know, having very open IP, or through to, you know, having approaches which would allow protection of intellectual property, which then leads to a commercialisation pathway. So typically for CRCs, they shouldn't really just have a commercialisation pathway, they should have a translational pathway as well, so they have a positive impact at local community levels, as well as for commercial impact there as well. The CRC board comes in very strongly into that process, and often you'll see when you see outputs of projects emerging, that's often, you know, it may not be in the first year or two, it could be, say, from year 3 onwards. The CRC board is going to play a very important role, especially in terms of triaging the outputs of projects and which pathway should it take. And therefore, you know, how do you treat that intellectual property within the CRC and for the sake of the partners as well. So there's a lot to be considered in there, and there isn't a singular model which is in place for CRCs. So there's quite a bit of flexibility in there, but also it needs a lot of design and discussion, especially with the various partners who, as they come on board, you know, in the bid process, but also in the CRC proper process. So when you look at the range of CRCs, and if anyone wants to look at CRCs which are have their websites up and running, one of the CRC bids which has its website up and running is the Scaling Green Hydrogen CRC, but there are quite a few CRCs which are already up and running and funded. And in that process, you do see a typical contribution schedule for partners. Typical, looking across the various, would be $250,000 cash per annum, plus in-kind for what we would call platinum partners, and then stepping down to 100,000, 50,000, 25. And then, you know, what's really important in CRCs, and it's been increasingly focused upon to ensure that supports training, capability building and adoption, is involvement of SMEs in the CRC. So it's very strongly encouraged. And of course, you know, SMEs don't have the availability of resources at their disposal that the larger players have. So they are, you know, then they need to be treated differently in that way, in terms of they're not necessarily able to have the same cash contribution, but they should have a very important role to play in the CRC. So looking at the timelines that we're looking at the moment, and you can see in that graphic there down the bottom, this is the 2022-23 timeline. Stage 1 submissions have opened and this isn't firm yet because the previous round submissions haven't closed either, and with the election happening, it's a little bit harder to know when that's going to happen. So there's been nothing really that's come out which has given clarity around these dates. So these dates were kind of what were surmised earlier, you know, so earlier this year, but they could vary somewhat. But you know, it's still going to be fairly similar each year. So the stage 1 closes in July 2022, and then for those who get through stage 1, so you go through the process there, and you know, pretty much an expression of interest process. For those who get through to stage 2, it opens in late October and progresses through January 2023, where it closes, and then outcomes announced by March. Probably that will be pushed back somewhat. And then all the various contracting and coordination with the funding agency occurs with, you know, a degree of expectation, I suppose, for commencement in October 2023. You know, we would probably expect the dates for 2023, 2024 to be somewhat similar there. You know, really what has to be done is progressing discussions with potential partners, including industry partners, government partners and research partners, as well as community partners. Research program development as co-design process with key partners. There's been no formal notification to the Cooperative Research Association of the bidders yet. Once you do that, then, you know, it goes up on the site, and that's why it's also pretty useful then to have a website which can give you the visibility around a bid from that point onwards. And just to give a bit of an indication, the typical lead times in terms of a CRC bid, and we're discussing with a number of CRC bids just to, you know, see where they're at, how they're progressing, and also how they're doing it. So the Scaling Green Hydrogen CRC, it's been, you know, probably upwards of 18 months that it's been under development, and they would be likely to submit in the round that's coming up nominally in July this year. So it is a substantial process, bringing partners on board, especially where they're funding, you know, you're trying to match their budgetary cycles as well, getting clear decision making about commitments, and of course chasing letters and such is always a really challenging part to that process, and it's very time and resource intensive then as well. So what's next? Probably, you know, the main things here and the main reason to be talking about this is not to go into excessive detail, because we don't really have that kind of level of detail yet, and there's a lot of things that are unknown, you know, at this point in time. But just flagging it, getting the ideas and getting people kind of understanding the process for a CRC bid is very important. And once you kind of understand that process, and some people have been through that entire process once or more before, so are quite familiar with it. But once you kind of get familiar with that process, then hopefully it brings on more engagement and involvement, not just in the bid process, but obviously, you know, going forward, if we were to be successful down the track with the CRC. So important in there is engagement, involvement, further developing the design of the programs. And I keep stressing they're not set in stone. That's really what they look like at the moment, and they're evolving. And you know, when we kind of talk with partners and we talk internally, and that new ideas come forward, there are some challenging areas too. You know, like the focus with this bid, we would like it to be around solutions for agriculture. So that kind of raises issues, little tricky issues in a way, like offsets, for example. So offsets for other industry sectors is quite challenging. Sequestration is another one, and markets in terms of carbon and other markets. There's a lot of work being done in those areas. That's, you know, we need to articulate with those initiatives and be up to date with what's happening there, but it's not necessarily going to be within the remit of the bid going forward. The other aspect of the CRC is that, you know, you're in a fairly busy space. So anyone who's been involved in CRCs, if you look at all the different, and I should have put a graphic up, which sorry, I meant to grab, but looking at the various CRCs which are underway currently, and ones which are in the bid process. So some examples, two that UQ is somewhat involved in currently, the Blue Economy CRC, which actually has a lot of aquaculture in there, and the Marine Bioproducts CRC, which was fairly recently funded. And UQ's involvement is in, well, Rob Capon from UQ is the lead on one of the programs there, which is focused, that program is around marine bioproducts themselves for, you know, different applications. The green hydrogen CRC, but there's a whole range of CRCs in place now, but also that have, you know, been in place for some time, or historically were in place, which really need to inform us of what the design of this CRC will be going forward, so that we're not stepping on toes, but also we're articulating effectively with existing and likely upcoming CRCs. So there is quite a bit of work which is required there to ensure that we're fitting in with that ecosystem of the CRCs, as well as obviously fitting in with the ecosystem around agriculture as well in this space. So there are some strategic challenges with mounting a CRC, and getting it right is not easy. So a lot of discussion and informing and input is quite important there. And then the second one in that list is alerting and connecting with industry and community partners. Just, you know, if there's an awareness that this is coming through, and this is one of the reasons why also having a website can be really quite useful, because you can direct people at a website, and it gives sufficient information about the CRC to give them a level of understanding there. And very much aligning with policy developments and initiatives is a really important part of that the whole CRC process. And we know, I mean, especially in this emission space, that's changing rapidly. And with changes of government, we don't know, like there's going to be quite a few developments which we have to keep the finger on the pulse with. And having, extensive involvement with government is an important part of that process as well, but also involvement with our industry partners and tapping into a wide range and diversity of industry partners, as well as ensuring that we're closely connected at the community level as well. So look, not a lot of detail there as yet, but it gives a little bit of background to what we're doing. I'd also like to thank Megan Pope for doing our logo. So all of these things have been done in-house to date. We're not really at a stage where we're going full spec on all of the what they call marketing collateral. So we're just getting things up and running, but I think the work that looks really quite good, and it tries to get the message that we're incorporating a range of different areas of agriculture. So thanking you for your time, and I hope that that gives you a little bit of information that can be useful. And as we progress with this, first of all, we're not sure at this stage, which submission date would be appropriate. So there's work to be done there. And as we progress also, the involvement of lots of different people will change what we're developing and will help evolve that quite effectively. I kind of go back to, even if you look at the titles of those programs, they've changed quite a bit. So there is an evolution which keeps happening there. And one thing which was in one of them, which is not there very prominently now, which probably really should be, is policy as well. So we've been talking a lot about policy. We need to make sure it's very explicit in there. And with that, I'll bring Ollie back in and give people the chance to ask the questions in terms of the Q&A. So over to you, Ollie.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much to Damien for the presentation, and I hope it was very informative for all the participants. I see we do have a few questions coming up in the Q&A. Before we start, people are still using the chat function, so please do not write questions in the chat function, because we can't capture them very easily after the session is over. So please, if you have written in the chat, redirect to the Q&A so that we can capture your questions. We have a number of questions here around how emissions are being calculated. So we had questions from Michael about total ag emissions and whether CO2 only really accounts for 4%. He said, I thought that between 1 to 2% of total fossil fuel use goes into production of fertilizers, which would equate to 5 to 10% of ag emissions. We also had a similar question from Graham Hammer about what is the how do intensive inputs get calculated in the farm system, for example, nitrogen fertilizer, diesel for cropping. We also had a question from Craig, which was similar, about what does the 4% of CO2 from emissions from ag include? So does it include farm transport? Is there a consideration of off-farm transport emissions? So maybe we can start with that bundle of questions about how this total is, how we've come up with these numbers.
Yeah. So luckily we haven't come up with the numbers. So those numbers particularly come from ABARES and working with DOR, but they're also across those, in terms of methane and nitrous oxide in particular, it's carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's the equivalent emissions for each of those. So those have been calculated along IPCC guidelines. It's not really, and this is I think these are really good questions and points, but they're also issues for this CRC as well, in terms of the extent to which we're directly involved in the measurement and monitoring process, building baselines. We need to be involved in those, but they're not necessarily going to be the core of the CRC. The focus is much more about the abatement mitigation process in terms of solutions and technologies with the emissions themselves. So the measurability is going to be critically important in there. But we haven't really designed in, anything which is not already in play, and we'd be working with partners around that in terms of making sure that we're utilising, nationally and internationally accepted parameters for those, rather than any advocacy of, veering away from that, which I don't think would be a sensible thing for us to do.
Okay, I hope this has helped with that bunch of questions. We have I'm going to just flip to a question which I think is important, and one of the aspects of why we're having the seminar today. That there's a question on when will you be exploring research capacity at UQ to build a team across the whole of UQ, and do you have industry partners? So I think part of this seminar today is all about improving internal communication. So maybe I'll just pass that one over to Damien.
Yeah, and look, first response is this is a UQ, well, it's not even a bid yet. So, but when if and when it becomes a bid, it will be a UQ bid, which is very important. And that then, requires a lot of communication and coordination across UQ. So, there are early discussions which are taking place, particularly across science and in engineering, and just to a lesser extent so far with the other institutes as well. So we're just starting that process of ensuring that not only do we get that awareness happening, but we get the communication, coordination and development happening. So this is really the first step in that process. And I do emphasize, as I have a number of times, there's nothing set in stone, there's nothing in concrete here. And, these are very early stages. So the more involvement, input, ideas, insights that we actually capture and gain, across UQ, and also, as you say, building on the research capacity and capability across UQ is particularly important. So, we've kind of started that process, but there's a long way to go yet in terms of that process.
Okay, so we also now have some questions. Again, it's also looking at emissions aspects, so about pesticide and whether pesticides are captured within this CRC.
I'm not an expert in the space, but I think it's important to incorporate any of those which do have any kind of impact in terms of the emissions, but also transitioning away from, in this case, synthetics, may well come into this process quite importantly, but also the manufacture of the pesticides. Initially, we were quite focused on farm because it's difficult to actually, cover that whole supply chain, value chain in terms of the manufacture of pesticides, fertilizers and things like that. But because they impact the farm and then they impact the entire emissions process and the entire supply chain. And then that kind of links in strongly with market access as well, then all of that really is pertinent to what we're doing. So making sure that we're capturing each of these in the appropriate way, with whether it be within a program or across programs is important. So any of those types of questions, I think, point to, what we're trying to do, which is to ensure that we're not leaving critical aspects of the emissions process out just by, nominating a program. We're slightly constrained within the CRC model because you've only got those limited number of programs, but part of the circular economy argument is should be, covering a lot more ground there so that we can integrate across programs.
Okay, so we have a few more questions that are also asking about the framing or the scope of the CRC. I think an important one, there's a couple here. One is from Philip Brewer, and he's saying CSIRO claimed to have solved the problem of methane with algal feed supplements. So what is the extra contribution that the CRC can make? So I think that's an important one. And then we also had another question from Phil, a guest, who said, will we be looking at farm forestry, so agroforestry models as part of the CRC?
Okay, thanks, Phil. So we are looking at, and CSIRO is doing a lot of work in that space, which in terms of the, the methane emissions, methanogenesis, and looking at the supplements, especially utilising Asparagopsis in terms of reducing enteric fermentation. And look, it's critical because enteric fermentation is, the major cause of methane. But one thing that when you look at the data on the methane emissions, and you look at the herds across Australia, and again, this isn't my area of expertise, it's much more in the Centre for Animal Science. If you look at the herd life cycle and cattle life cycle, about 90% overall in terms of beef cattle, certainly, which is where a lot of the emissions occur, is not in feedlots. So the solutions in terms of supplements, a lot of those solutions are quite focused on feedlots because that's where you can actually administer that solution more effectively. But the reality is that if you've got, 95% of the enteric fermentation happening in grasslands, pasture lands, then that is a solution, and that's an important part of the solution. But there's a lot more which is happening, which is not really occurring in feedlots. That doesn't preclude us doing two things, potentially working a lot with CSIRO, which we do, and also, having a feedlot component in there that, the grasslands is and, the grass fed is a pretty important part of what we've been looking at so far. Farm forestry, yes. I'm just mindful of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of, and this is one of the reasons why I was talking about just being wary of where we go and controlling the scope of this CRC without leaving gaping holes. But the farm forestry is important in there, but it also comes, close in with the carbon markets. And we're seeing a lot at the moment, which is raising some concerns around that in terms of the appropriate measurement and also the impact of those markets. So just at the moment, we're keeping a watching brief, and we're talking with appropriate people, but I'm not saying that's in or out because it's far too early to say that with anything. But it is a difficult area for a CRC to go into when it's quite well developed, and it's also going through a fairly harsh, process at the moment. So it's not very, Phil, it's not a very kind of, complete response there, but again, it's our scoping that we're trying to get right, and where also the strengths are amongst the different partners. And we haven't got to those partners very much yet, so we still at those early stages as well in terms of discussions with various partners and who would be on board. So again, early stage, but again, this is why we're doing this, so that we've got people who are within UQ and beyond UQ that we're starting to get the basic initial message out.
Okay, thank you for that, Damien. We have lots of questions coming in now. Again, I just request, please do not use the chat. I still saw there were a few comments in chat that haven't maybe migrated to the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'll do my best to cover as many of these as possible. There is a question from Jubon, again, I think similar to the one before, about how do we put an expression of interest forward. So I'm assuming that's within UQ, but if it were a partner. So Damien, maybe you can speak a bit to how people who are interested can coordinate with the bid team. I think that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Again, we're not up to a submission yet with the Cooperative Research Association. But in terms of the bid team, and Ollie and I had a small chat about this, and I think Steve Williams is an important one in that process. Steve is a part of that team, and directing interest. We need to make sure that we're coordinating that. We want to get as much involvement as possible. So rather than kind of giving you all the different names of people, I think of it, if they go through to Steve, that would help in that process. So Steve Williams is the Deputy Director, Strategy and Engagement for QAAFI. So that might be a good first port of call.
Okay, we're getting, we have a question on rice. So as a former ERI employee, I would be remiss.
You can answer this one.
I can answer that.
Not nice.
So the question is from Hom, a guest. It says there is greenhouse contribution by flooded rice cropping, which could be minimized by aerobic rice cultivation, i.e. direct seeded rice, alternate wetting and drying. Even under that situation, this system also contribute greenhouse gas, i.e. nitrous oxide. How could we minimize nitrous oxide emissions? Well, yeah, maybe I'm not the right person to answer this question. I think we do need to look at the different types of plant production systems that will be included within the CRC bid. There is a lot of work going into direct seeded rice. ACEA has been funding a lot of work, particularly in places like Laos, on this topic. So there is a lot more we can do to improve direct seeded rice systems. But there's a lot of issues, obviously, also around weed management and how to maintain yields and production. So if we were to include rice systems, they would definitely be, they are an important source of methane emissions, and we'd be looking at how to reduce those. So nothing is set in stone, as Damien said, yet. We haven't decided on the programs, but this would be something that would be worth discussing when research workshops are held, which does lead me to another question. There was a question on when will there be brainstorming workshops happening, and how can people get involved? So maybe, Damien, you can talk a bit to that, particularly with your hat on as a interim program lead for the circular economy one.
Yeah, we'd be hoping that that's going to start happening within the next month. Just a caveat to everything is again, which submission round that we're going to be submitting to, and there's question marks over that. But that's an important part of this process in terms of not just communication engagement, but actually deeper input in terms of the brainstorming process. So we would like that to happen, and we've got that in our kind of basic Gantt chart that we have at the moment. And we had that in, I think, late April, but then it's just a matter of whether we can make enough progress before then to get to that point. So I think, at the moment we're already into, the 5th of April. So, it might push back to May, but brainstorming is going to be really important in that process. And it should be, we should have a kind of a broad range of people involved in that. I'm just noticing it's 12:55. So one thing I just wanted to say is, and I'm assuming, I've only been to a couple of these, so I'm assuming if there are other questions, we can kind of answer them offline or later on. I would assume that there's scope to do that, so we don't ignore any questions. Hopefully we can do that and get back to people with more detailed answers, but also just to make sure that people are feeling like they're involved in the process and they're a little bit aware of the process. So if we want to keep doing that and keeping the communication happening. This is kind of just the first time that many people have seen the, you know, even slides and logo and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's important just to get that out there and give some of the initial information. There, as usual, and you can see by the questions, there are a lot of, it just raises more questions than it answers, as is often the case with these. That's fine. I think that's a good part of that co-design, co-creation process. And so the more that we can capture those and bring them in, I think will be important. Yeah, sorry to babble at the end there.
No, I think that's a very important point. Maybe just to reiterate, we are at the beginning. We are not clear whether we'll be able to go for the next round or not. There was a question on, do we have industry partners lined up? And at the moment we are talking with a number of industry partners, but we haven't finalized any partners yet. So it may well be that this does get delayed until next year, but we're still pushing ahead at the moment. So just to rest assured to all the participants listening that it will be a whole of UQ team effort. Now we come to the end of the session, and I just want to announce that our next QAAFI seminar will be held on the 12th of April. The title will be Understanding and Mitigating Causes of Calf Mortality, and it will be presented by Dr. Kieran McCosker, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Animal Science. So please do tune in next week for that one. And with that, I would like to thank everyone.
Yes, thank you very much.
We will be capturing all the comments and questions that came in the QA box. I apologize if we didn't get through to your question. We just move on to the last slide.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So if you would like to leave any feedback, please could you use the QR codes here, and you can also get information on upcoming QAAFI Science seminars with the QR code on the left-hand side of the screen. So have a good lunch, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.